The day I graduated college, my father leaned in, close enough that the applause faded behind us, and whispered, "This degree is useless." No anger, no laughter, just a fact, as if he were telling me the weather. Then he patted my shoulder, straightened his tie, and posed for the family photos. My mother smiled like she'd been rehearsing for months, holding the bouquet she'd bought that morning. Dad stood a step behind us, expression half lost in thought, phone always in hand. When my cousin posted the picture, she captioned it, "So proud of our grad." But if you looked carefully, my father's eyes were already elsewhere, toward whatever machine or contract he imagined breaking down without him. Henry Coleman had built his company from nothing. Coleman Precision Components made industrial parts for bigger machines, metal gears, shafts, bearings, things with weight and measurable worth. He'd bought the shop when I was 6, mortgaging our house and using his father's inheritance to keep the doors open. Since then, everything he owned smelled faintly of oil, diesel, and cold ambition. Real value, he liked to say, knocking his knuckle against a gear, is when you can weigh it. That sentence followed me through college. I studied finance and operations, a compromise between my dreams and his reality. I loved learning how systems worked, how numbers told stories, but he believed the only truth was torque and grit. When I talked about data analytics or logistics modeling, he'd grunt, "People have been managing without spreadsheets for 50 years. The night before graduation, at dinner, he asked, "So what's next? Another degree? Some consulting job where you tell real workers what they're doing wrong?" "Analyst role," I said. "Cartwright and Ash. Audit and advisory." He set down his fork. "So you'll sit in an office and get paid to criticize men who build things, to help them run better?" I answered. He smiled without warmth. "Cheaper, you mean?" My mother's eyes pleaded silently for peace. Dad didn't shout, but his disapproval was an atmosphere. You breathed it until you stopped noticing. I'd learned long ago that he wasn't cruel. He simply believed comfort bred softness. To him, every challenge he gave me was a lesson in survival. I'd spent one summer working at the shop. He refused to let me touch a machine, but I watched the rhythm of the place. The steady pulse of lathes, the banter of machinists, the smell of coolant and sweat. The men there respected my father, feared him, maybe, but they worked hard because he worked harder. Still, I noticed cracks in the system. Invoices tracked on sticky notes, passwords written on the wall, inventory done by feel. When I found thousands of dollars worth of material that had been miscounted, Dad called it a good catch and nothing more. The next day, he told me not to waste ink printing colored charts. That was the story of our relationship. Me trying to measure, him trying to remind me that not everything needs measuring. On graduation day, I kept telling myself his whisper didn't matter. I had a job, a plan, a girlfriend who believed in me. Maya was everything my father wasn't: warm, expressive, the kind of person who made the world softer just by existing. Her parents hugged me like family the first time we met. My father shook my hand and said, "Dentists have it easy. No one argues with a numb mouth." After the ceremony, we went to our usual diner. My father salted his eggs before tasting them, asked about metal suppliers. Then, as if the thought had just come to him, said, "Still seeing that girl?" "Yeah. She's moving to Chicago for med school. We're going to try long distance." "Trying," he said. "That's what people say when they don't want to decide." My mother sighed, and I let the conversation die. Later that night, I stood on the bridge by the river, watching the reflection of city lights tremble across the water. I told myself I'd prove him wrong. Not with words, but with results he couldn't ignore. Maybe someday he'd see that ideas had weight too. 2 days later, I stopped by the shop. Dad was barking into the phone about a delayed shipment. The air inside felt the same as always, humid, loud, efficient in its chaos. Sandra, his office manager, waved at me. "Your dad told me you graduated top of your class," she said. "He's proud." I laughed. "Did he use that word?" "Not exactly, but he hasn't stopped talking about your fancy spreadsheets." "That's close enough." Upstairs, Dad hung up the phone, rubbing his temples. "You're here early." Wanted to see the place, I said. It's been a while. He gestured around the office. Still standing. Still making money. Still real. I hesitated, then said, I could help you modernize a few things. Just small improvements, nothing crazy. He leaned back. Modernize? We've been fine for 20 years. You could be better, I said before I could stop myself. If you let me try. He studied me for a long moment. You've got theories. I've got bills. When theory pays the bills, call me. I left his office with my face hot. Outside, the shop floor clattered and hummed. Oblivious. The men nodded at me politely, the boss's son, the college boy. To them, I wasn't one of them and never would be. That night, I told Maya what he'd said at graduation. She laughed softly, shaking her head. Maybe he just doesn't know how to say he's proud. Or maybe he means it. He doesn't. Trust me. My dad's the same way. Different words, same language. I hope you're right. For the next few weeks, I helped Mom prepare for a small party to celebrate my job offer. Dad promised he'd attend but spent most evenings at the shop, coming home after midnight smelling of coolant and fatigue. Sometimes I'd hear him in the kitchen, muttering numbers under his breath, as if reciting prayers. When I offered to help, he waved me off. You've got bigger fish to fry in August, he said. Still, something in his tone worried me. Business had been slowing since one of his big clients switched suppliers. He didn't say it outright, but I could read it in the way he stared at his phone during dinner, waiting for calls that didn't come. One weekend, I drove by and found him alone in the shop, sitting on a crate, staring at a half-finished order. Short-staffed, I asked. Always, he said. People don't want to work anymore. You could automate some of this, I said carefully. A better inventory system. He cut me off. I'm not paying for software that tells me what I already know. The conversation ended there. We'd hit that invisible wall again, the one between his world and mine. That night, I sat in my old room, staring at the graduation cap hanging from my desk lamp. I replayed his whisper over and over. This degree is useless. Maybe he was right, I thought. Maybe numbers couldn't fix what pride had built. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized his world was changing whether he liked it or not. Suppliers were merging, contracts moving online, orders tracked digitally. The gears he trusted were still turning, but the machines surrounding them were different. If he didn't adapt, the business he'd built would rust out from beneath him. I wanted to help, but he'd never let me. So I told myself I'd take the job, learn everything I could about efficiency, risk, and structure, and someday come back with the credibility he'd respect. Someday, I'd prove that my degree wasn't useless. He'd eat those words. Just not yet. I was halfway through my last summer before starting at Cartwright and Ash when the call came at dawn. Your father's in the hospital, Mom said, voice trembling like a wire in wind. He fell at the shop. They think he broke some ribs. I sat up, half awake, half denying. How bad? Bad enough they made him stay overnight. He's angry about that. Of course he was. My father believed rest was a conspiracy against productivity. When I arrived, he was in the ER, propped up like a man negotiating with pain itself. His face was pale, the skin around his eyes gray. But his tone, steady, sharp, hadn't changed. Don't look at me like that, he said. It's just ribs. The floor was slick. You slipped. Some idiot spilled oil near the press. I'll fix it when I'm back. The doctor said he'd fractured 2 ribs and bruised a lung. He needs rest, she emphasized, looking at me when she said it. Weeks of it. No heavy lifting, no going to the shop. Dad's answer, define heavy. When we brought him home, he looked small in his recliner. His throne, Mom called it, surrounded by stacks of invoices he'd insisted on bringing from the office. He slept in patches, waking to bark orders into his phone. The shop, he said, couldn't run without him. He was right, and that scared me more than I admitted. By day 4, he'd driven Mom half-mad with calls to employees. She'd hang up and whisper, he can't help himself. Finally, she turned to me. You go, she said. Make sure everything's not falling apart. I can't just walk in and start ordering people around, I said. I didn't say order. Just help. Then softer. He won't ask you to, but he needs you. So I went. The shop looked different without his presence, like a hive missing its queen. Sandra, his office manager, greeted me with tired eyes. He's been calling every hour, she sighed. We're drowning. What's the problem? She handed me a stack of papers. Take your pick. Late shipments, miscounted inventory, supplier errors. Half the staff's confused who's approving what. The production board looked like chaos. Dates crossed out, new ones scrawled in marker, a storm of handwriting. I recognized Dad's system, his mind made visible, but no one else could decipher it. It was a perfect example of his control. Efficient when he was there, impossible when he wasn't. I walked the floor. Machines roared and hissed, but the rhythm felt off. A run of aluminum housings sat untouched because a key machinist had left early to handle childcare. Another man was redoing parts that had already been approved. No one seemed certain what the priorities were. That evening I stayed late, making notes. I didn't know what authority I had, but I couldn't stand watching the place crumble. I mapped out schedules, identified bottlenecks, and flagged missing parts. The spreadsheet I built that night became the start of something, a system, a pulse monitor. When I sent it to Sandra the next morning, she laughed. Color-coded? He's going to kill you. Tell him it's temporary. She smirked. Or tell him it works. Within a week, the chaos began to ease. The men were skeptical at first. Some called me college boy behind my back. But when the orders started going out on time again, the teasing softened. They saw I wasn't there to play boss. I was just trying to help them breathe. One afternoon, Sandra whispered, "You know, he's been calling less. Maybe he trusts you." I wanted to believe that. Then he came back. 3 weeks after the fall, he walked into the shop, ribs still bandaged, jaw set. The moment he saw the printed schedules on the wall, the spreadsheets pinned beside the time cards, I felt the temperature drop. "What's all this?" he asked, voice too calm. "Just trying to make things clearer," I said. "Sandra and I didn't ask for changes. You weren't here," I reminded him carefully. "Someone had to keep it running." He stared at me. "You think this place needs fixing?" "I think it needs a future." The silence after that was long enough to count in breaths. Then he said, "When you work for other people, you'll learn they don't like being told what they already know." "I'm not working for other people," I said. "I'm trying to help you." "Then stop helping." He turned and walked away. That night, he didn't speak at dinner. Mom tried to fill the air with weather and grocery talk, but it was useless. Finally, he said, "You start that fancy job in August, right? Make sure you stick to it." "I plan to." "Good." He looked at me like a foreman approving a resignation. The next month felt like walking through fog. We coexisted, polite but cold. I worked part-time at the shop until my start date, fixing minor issues, avoiding direct confrontation. He kept his distance but couldn't resist little jabs. "Your reports look nice on paper," he'd say. "Too bad paper doesn't cut steel." Still, I saw things he didn't or refused to. One major client, Cobalt Engineering, had begun delaying payments. Another, Ridgeline Motors, was hinting at cheaper overseas options. The world was shifting under him, but he treated every warning like a mosquito to swat. When I brought it up, he said, "Clients always threaten to leave. You hold steady, they crawl back. But what if they don't? Then we find new ones. Been doing that longer than you've been alive." His stubbornness was a fortress. No matter what I said, it bounced off stone walls. Maya called often, planning her move to Chicago. "How's your dad?" she'd ask. "Same," I said. "Still convinced he's indestructible." "You're worried." "Yeah," I admitted. "If something big happens, something he can't muscle through, he'll take the company down with him. Maybe he needs to fall before he learns to bend," she said gently. I didn't know then how literal her words would become. My first day at Cartwright and Ash was nothing like the shop. The office smelled like coffee and ambition, not oil and sweat. People spoke in buzzwords: synergy, margin efficiency, cost drivers. I wore suits, learned to present findings with confidence, and got used to clients calling me son before realizing I was the one auditing their books. But every time I stared at a balance sheet, I thought of my father's hands, scarred, powerful, unyielding, and wondered what he'd say if he saw me now. Probably something like, "You can't polish steel with a spreadsheet." Still, I couldn't help noticing patterns. We audited mid-sized manufacturers, and I saw how easily good businesses failed when they ignored modernization. One case mirrored my father's shop exactly. Family-run, loyal employees, old systems, slipping margins. They refused to digitize until it was too late. When the founder's health failed, the company folded within months. The son, an accountant, had to sell the assets to cover debts. I read that report twice, unable to shake the resemblance. I visited home that weekend. Dad was in the garage, tuning his truck, the smell of oil thick around him. I told him about my new job, the clients, the systems we implemented to prevent collapse. He didn't look up. "Theory again?" "Experience now," I said. "I see companies like yours every week. Then you see people who forgot how to work." "No," I said quietly. "I see people who worked hard but refused to change." He froze for a moment, then laughed. "And you think that scares me?" "It should." That earned me silence again, the kind that told me I'd gone too far. Months passed. My job was demanding but rewarding. Maya thrived in med school, though distance stretched us thin. Every call ended with promises we both knew might fade. I tried to visit home monthly. Each time, the shop seemed a little dimmer. Fewer orders, more worry lines on Sandra's face. Then, one December evening, I stopped by unannounced. I found Dad alone in the office, surrounded by bills. The company logo, once proud and bold, was faded on the window behind him. "Working late?" I asked. He didn't look up. "Always." I picked up one of the letters on his desk. "Final notice?" I read aloud before he snatched it from my hand. "None of your concern." "Dad," I said, "none of your concern." He was breathing harder now, wincing as his ribs protested. For a second, I saw something new in his face. Not anger, but fear. "What happened?" He rubbed his temples. "Client pulled out. Bank's tightening terms. Nothing I can't fix. Let me help. You already have your job. Leave this to me. Please, just let me look at the numbers." "No," he barked. "I won't have you turning my life's work into another one of your audits." The words hit like a door slamming shut. I left without another word. But that image, him sitting there, surrounded by papers he could no longer control, stayed with me long after I drove away. In January, Sandra called. "I'm sorry to bother you, but your father's, he's not himself. Payroll's late. Orders are backing up. He won't talk to anyone." I felt my stomach drop. "I'll come down." When I arrived, the place was chaos again. Unpaid vendors, idle machines, workers restless. I found him in his office, staring at the floor. "Dad," I said softly, "let me help." He looked up, eyes tired. "You think you can fix everything with your laptop?" "No," I said, "but I can try before it's too late." He didn't answer. The silence stretched, heavy with pride, regret, and everything we'd never said. That night, I stayed at the shop until dawn, poring over invoices, trying to trace the holes. Somewhere between the columns of numbers, I realized what he couldn't admit. Coleman Precision Components was on the edge of collapse. And this time, my degree might be the only thing that could save it. When I drove back to the shop the next morning, fog hung over the river like smoke. The parking lot was half empty, a bad sign for a weekday. Inside, the air felt wrong. Too quiet for a place that used to sing with motion. Sandra sat at her desk with a stack of overdue notices, her face pale. "Morning," I said. She looked up, eyes rimmed red. "It's bad, Mason. We're weeks behind on deliveries. 2 clients canceled their contracts yesterday." "Where's my father?" "In his office. He hasn't eaten since yesterday." I knocked, but he didn't answer. When I stepped in, he was sitting in the dark, staring at a ledger. His hair, once so neatly combed, was falling loose. He didn't even look up. "Dad," I said, "talk to me. It's handled." "No, it's not. You're drowning." His voice came flat. "I built this place with my hands. I won't let you dissect it like a lab rat." "This isn't about pride," I said, trying to steady my tone. "It's about survival." He laughed, low and bitter. "You think those degrees give you the right to tell me how to run what I made?" "I think they give me tools," I said. "Tools you never had to use." He finally looked at me. His eyes were tired, but the fire was still there. "You don't understand. The bank wants their payment." Cobalt pulled out. "The machines need servicing." "I can't." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "I'll find a way." He always said that. He'd found a way through recessions, supplier strikes, machinery breakdowns, but this was different. The world had shifted while he was too busy working to notice. I sat down opposite him. "Let me look through the books. Just look. If I can't find anything, I'll walk away. But if I can, you let me help." He didn't agree, but he didn't say no either. That night, I combed through everything: statements, invoices, purchase orders. What I found made my stomach knot. Half the company's cash flow was tangled in unpaid invoices from clients who'd already switched suppliers. Loans had been refinanced under punishing rates. The equipment lease was overdue. If nothing changed, Coleman Precision Components would run out of money within 6 weeks. When I showed him the numbers, he went quiet. Then he said, "Numbers lie." "They don't," I said softly. "But people can. Especially the ones who promise to pay you." He stood, pacing. "You think you can fix this? With what, your laptop? Your charts?" "With a plan," I said. "I've seen companies recover from worse. You need new contracts, a restructuring plan, and someone the bank trusts to negotiate." "And who's that?" "You." "Yes." He slammed his hand on the desk. "You don't get it, Mason. This company is me. If it dies, so do I." The words echoed. I saw for the first time the terror behind his pride. He wasn't just stubborn, he was scared. The business was the only language he'd ever spoken, and now it was slipping away. For 3 days, I barely slept. I called suppliers, talked to the bank, and sketched out what a turnaround might look like. It wasn't glamorous. Debt consolidation, contract renegotiations, a temporary pay cut for management. But it was real. When I brought it to him, he looked at the pages as if they were written in another alphabet. "You'd put my name on a document that says I failed." "No," I said. "I'd put your name on one that says you survived." He looked away, jaw tightening. "I can't sign this." So I did something reckless. I called the bank myself. The manager, a gray-haired man named Sullivan, remembered me from the summer I'd interned there. "You're Henry Coleman's boy, right?" he said. "We've been trying to reach him." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm here." He sighed. "We can't keep extending his line of credit. Unless something changes, foreclosure is inevitable." "What if someone bought him out?" I asked. "Took over the debt, restructured operations." Sullivan frowned. "You have that kind of capital?" "Not yet," I admitted. "But I can raise it." He studied me. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." For weeks, I worked 2 jobs, days at Cartwright and Ash, nights building a proposal to investors. I reached out to 2 senior partners I trusted, explained the situation, and showed them the numbers. They were skeptical until they saw the upside. Valuable equipment, skilled workers, and contracts that could be revived with the right management. "This could work," one of them said, "but it needs a clean buyout. No shared control." Meaning my father would have to sell. When I told him, he looked at me like I'd shot him. "Sell? To you?" "I'll buy you out, Dad. You'll still be part of it. Advisory if you want, but you won't have to fight alone." He shook his head slowly. "You think you're rescuing me. You're not. You're stealing what I built." "I'm saving it from dying with you," I said. "If you keep this up, you'll lose everything." "I'd rather lose it than hand it over to a child who's never turned a wrench." The argument burned hot and fast. Mom tried to intervene, but he stormed out before she could speak. I followed him outside, into the cold night air. He turned, face flushed with fury. "You think you're better than me," he said. "Because you went to college, because you sit behind a desk." "I don't think I'm better," I said. "I just think different, and different might be what saves us." "Us?" He laughed. "There's no us anymore. You made that clear." He drove off, leaving tire marks in the snow. A week later, I got the call I dreaded. Sandra's voice cracked. "Mason, he collapsed at the shop. They think it was his heart." When I reached the hospital, he was pale and quiet, hooked to wires. The doctor said he'd had a mild heart attack, made worse by stress and exhaustion. "Can I see him?" I asked. "Briefly," she said. He opened his eyes as I approached. "Still fixing things?" he murmured. "Trying," I said. A weak smile. "You get that from your mother." For the first time, there was no edge in his voice, no armor. Just weariness. "Rest," I told him. "I'll handle the shop." He nodded faintly. "Don't sell it to fools." "I won't," I promised. He drifted back to sleep, and I stood there for a long time, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Over the next month, everything moved fast. The partners at Cartwright and Ash agreed to back my buyout if I ran the company under their restructuring division. The bank approved the transfer. Legally, Coleman Precision Components became Coleman Industrial Systems, LLC, with me as CEO. The day the papers were signed, I visited him at home. He was recovering, slower than he admitted, but alert. I placed the folder on his lap. "It's done," I said. "The company's safe. The debt's cleared. Everyone keeps their jobs." He stared at the document, lips trembling. "You bought it." "I bought it," I said quietly. "From you." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he leaned back, eyes glistening. "You actually did it." "I had to." He exhaled slowly, something between defeat and relief. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "Guess your degree wasn't so useless after all." In the weeks after the buyout, the building felt different. Same brick husk by the river, same gulls heckling the loading dock, same forklift rattling like an old man clearing his throat. Yet something in the air had shifted. Maybe it was because the name on the paperwork had changed. Maybe it was because the first thing I did was swap the curling whiteboard for a live dashboard that anyone could read without needing the codebook inside my father's head. Or maybe it was because the people on the floor sensed, before I did, that the company had moved from surviving to deciding. I started with the smallest lever, clarity. I posted a daily run list at 7:30 a.m., printed and on screens, simple enough to pass the blink test. Top 3 jobs, why they mattered, where the risk lived. I added a rule. If a machine went down, the first-line supervisor called maintenance and me. No triangulation through hope. I reworked purchasing with supplier scorecards, not to punish but to see. We negotiated lead time guarantees in exchange for steadier volumes. When a supplier balked, I showed them our plan, line by line, and asked, "Do you want to grow with us or watch from the bleachers?" Most chose to grow. Those who didn't made room for those who would. Not all changes needed charts. I walked the floor with a notebook and, more importantly, empty hands. Pete admitted he skipped lunch and shook in the afternoon. We moved his break and the miscuts fell by half. Marshall confessed he couldn't read the old job travelers without his glasses. We increased font size and watched rework drop. "You're making this a kindergarten," one machinist teased. "Then we should be the smartest kindergarten in the state," I said, and he grinned. The bank sent an auditor to observe our first month. I shook his hand and then insisted he wear ear protection, which made him listen better. He saw what I wanted him to see. Order where there had been noise, responsibility where there had been deference. He signed off and told his boss we were on a credible path. The phrase sounded dry, but it tasted like a beginning. At home, my father watched from the recliner like a general between campaigns. The first time I tried to tell him a win, new terms with Ridgeline Motors more favorable than the ones they'd taken overseas, he gave a curt nod and changed the subject to the ball joints on his truck. I didn't push. He was still learning to live with the idea that a company could have two lives. One he built by holding everything himself, and one I was building by letting go of the right pieces at the right time. He did ask to visit the shop. The doctor had cleared him for light walking, a phrase he disliked on principle, but he used it like a pass. When he arrived, the men straightened as if a tuning fork had been struck. He moved slower than before, hand gliding along railings he once ignored, eyes taking in the reorder boards, the maintenance logs, the simple signage that made his complicated world legible to everyone else. "What's that?" he asked, pointing at a screen near the punch clock. "Downtime map," I said. "Shows where we lost minutes yesterday and why." "Why do I care about minutes?" "Because hours are made of them." He grunted, the old punctuation, but he didn't dismiss it. He stood in front of the operators like a man found not guilty by a judge he doesn't fully trust and said, "Don't let the computers make you soft." Then he turned to me, lowered his voice, and added, "But if the computers can help you keep your fingers, use them." As spring turned to summer, we started saying no. This, more than the dashboards or the renegotiations, made the difference. We declined low-margin rush jobs that ate weekends and returned pennies. We stopped letting certain long-standing clients treat us like a backup plan. We released them and pursued ones who wanted partners. Saying no is a frightening luxury. Felt like removing a bad tooth and discovering you can chew again. I brought Dad the first quarter report, real numbers, not hope. Revenue up modestly. Cash conversion improving. Scrap down, overtime down, on-time delivery ticking into the green. "Not bad for a degree that can't weigh anything," I said, risking the joke. He smirked, then took a long time with the pages. When he reached the last line, he tapped the table twice, the way he used to tap the housing of a finished part. "Holds," he said. "Holds. The tolerance," he clarified. "You hit it." We never called what happened next an apology. It threaded itself through actions. He started coming in twice a week to sit with maintenance and teach them the tricks that lived in no manual. The sound a spindle makes when it's lying, the smell of coolant just before it turns. He told stories at lunch I'd never heard. How he'd taken a loan on his truck to make his first payroll. How he'd once slept in the office for 3 nights so a promised shipment left on time. He didn't praise me in public, but he stopped mocking the screens. When he saw me wearing earplugs, he took a pair too. One afternoon, I found him alone by the old manual lathe, running a piece of aluminum like a rosary through his fingers. He noticed me and said, "You changed the way this place breathes." "Better or worse?" "Different," he said. "And different is better." He swallowed, as if the words were bigger than his throat. Don't let the numbers make you blind to the men. But don't let the men make you blind to the numbers either. It was, in his dialect, a blessing. Outside the shop, my life was not on autopilot. Maya and I became one of those couples who schedule conversations, who treat love like a train you have to flag in the fog. She came home for a weekend in June and toured the shop with me, asking precise questions that warmed my heart and bewildered the crew. "You going to marry the doctor?" Sandra whispered as we watched Maya quiz a supplier over speakerphone. "If I don't, she'll marry me," I said, and it felt less like a joke and more like a plan. When Maya left, Dad, who had hovered at the edges like a moon, said, "She's sharp." It was the closest he'd ever come to saying, "I see why you choose her." Not every day was forward. We lost a big contract to a competitor who underbid us by a price that made me suspect they were buying market share with a bet I refused to match. A gearbox recall from 2 years earlier blew back with a lawsuit attached. I worked with counsel to settle and overlearned everything from it, building checks so conservative my father called them paranoid, until he saw how quickly they paid for themselves. We had a week in August when 3 machines were down at once, and I stood in the humming dark feeling like the world had finally called my bluff. We rented time at a neighboring shop, shipped parts at midnight, and delivered by breakfast. I slept in my office and woke with socket marks impressed in my cheek from a short nap taken on a box of fittings. But we made it. By fall, Coleman Industrial Systems, yes, I kept his name and changed only the word that mattered, had a rhythm that didn't rely on my proximity the way it once relied on his. We built an apprenticeship program with the community college. My favorite day of the month became the one where a kid in steel-toe boots asked me how to read a drawing, and I handed him not just the answer but a path. We added profit sharing with a clear formula posted in the break room. The first time it hit accounts, the room buzzed, and a veteran named Al squeezed my shoulder and said, "About time this place paid like it means we're part of it." Dad watched all of this and grew softer in the corners without surrendering his steel. He broke a rule one morning and came into my office without knocking, holding 2 coffees like an offering. "You busy?" he asked. "Always," I said. "Sit." He handed me a folded envelope. Inside, the original deed he'd signed when he bought the shop. The paper was thin from years of being unfolded and refolded. The ink faded to a brown that looked like it had been written by dusk. "I used to keep that in my wallet," he said, "to remind myself I'd gambled everything. Now I think you should have it." "I don't need proof," I said, throat tight. "It's not for proof," he replied. "It's for weight." We sat there for a while, not talking. Outside the window, a truck backed into the dock, and I could tell, by the careful way the driver straightened, that this place had taught him not just how to back up a trailer, but how to be someone who backs up carefully. That's what a business is, I thought. A school for 1,000 small competencies, each with a human attached. The next week, we held an open house. Not for clients, those we entertained with tours and on-time delivery, but for families. We set up orange cones so kids could race pallet jacks. We let them press the green button on a demo program and watch the machine carve their names into scrap aluminum they could take home as a talisman. I caught my father wiping his eyes when a boy held up his nameplate and yelled, "Dad, look!" Later, Dad cornered the maintenance crew and told them a story about how a well-oiled machine sounds like a cat purring. "A mean cat," he added, and the kids laughed. As the sun sank behind the river, he pulled me aside. "I was wrong," he said, voice so low I had to lean in. "About the degree. About you. About thinking the only way to love a thing is to carry it until your back breaks." He swallowed. "You didn't steal my company. You kept it from stealing me." I wanted to make light, to say something about returns on education, but the look on his face demanded respect. "You built the bones," I said. "I just learned to keep the blood moving." He nodded. "You did more than that." Then, after a long glance at the building, he added, "When I'm gone, make sure they remember the names of the parts we made and the names of the men who made them." "We will." Winter came. The river sheathed itself in a thin, stubborn gloss, and the shop kept humming. At night, I'd walk the aisles, touching the corners of pallets, reading the chalk on the floor like a priest reading a liturgy. I knew the place would outlive us both, and I wanted its memory to be decent. We added a plaque behind the front desk. "Coleman. Built by hand. Run by heart. Held by many." Dad hated sentiment, but he stood in front of that line a long time and finally said, "Not bad for a sentence that can't be weighed." On New Year's Eve, with snow feathering the streetlights, I took my parents to dinner. Mom beamed the way she had at graduation. Only this time the smile didn't have to defend itself. Dad raised his glass. "To stubborn sons," he said, "and to the women who teach them compassion." He looked at me. "To useless degrees," he added, pausing for effect, "that save your life." We clinked, and the sound was small and enormous at once. Later, when I drove them home, he stayed in the car for a minute after Mom went inside. The heater ticked. He stared at the dashboard like it held the faces of all the men he'd ever hired. "You know," he said, not looking at me, "I used to think if I let go, everything would fall." He exhaled, a long, careful breath. "Turns out you were standing there with your hands out the whole time." "I was," I said. "Still am." He nodded, opened the door, and then leaned back, a last thought. "You should put your name on it somewhere," he said. "Doesn't have to be big. Just so they know who held the line when it tried to break." I watched him walk inside, a little slower than the man who raised me, a little lighter than the man who whispered at my graduation. In the quiet that followed, I thought about weight and value, how some things you can put on a scale, and some things you carry in your chest until they change the way you stand. The next morning, I hung the deed he'd given me in my office. Not framed like a trophy, but tucked into a shadow box beside a bent drill bit, a cracked micrometer, and a first-day badge of a kid who just started and would, if we did this right, retire from here with stories that healed the parts of him nothing else could touch. On the back of the deed, I taped a small strip of paper, the speech I'd once wanted to give and never did. Real value is when people can weigh themselves and know they matter. Sometimes, when the shop is loud and the numbers line up and the air smells like effort and metal, I hear my father's whisper again. And this time, I let it land the way it always should have. Not as a verdict, but as a dare. A dare that taught me how to answer. He ate those words one quiet afternoon, sitting in my office with the deed between us like a bridge. He looked at me and said, almost smiling, "Maybe we were both right. You can weigh a degree after all. You just have to put it in the right hands." I reached across the desk, squeezed his shoulder, and held fast. The company thrummed around us, alive, and the river kept moving, and the future, for once, didn't feel like a debate. It felt like work we were both finally ready to share. Like and subscribe if you like this kind of video. Thank you.